All right. Well, it's 4:02, so let's get started. Um, I'm Courtney. I'm with the Winegrowers Association and very excited to welcome everybody to our second webinar for our Pinot Month celebration. Big thank you again to everyone participating who's helped make these possible, as well as Zacky's who helped us get the wine packs nationally. If you didn't get a wine pack for this webinar or any of them, they're still available, and all of these webinars are being recorded. Also, thank you to Corvin, who helped us get some of their great devices out, which allow for everyone to easily sample the wines without opening up many bottles at once. So thank you to both of those partners. If you missed last week, we went around Anderson Valley with Esther Mobley and explored the neighborhoods, as we're calling them. And today we're going to go deeper. We're going to go deeper into the geographical area of Anderson Valley known as the Deep End. This end is closest to the ocean. And has been informally marked by people in the region and the industry by the Mill Creek. So we're all learning, just as you are, trying to identify and understand Anderson Valley better. So thank you for being here with us. And I am going to pass it over to Tonya Pitts, sommelier and wine director from One Market down in San Francisco. And we are very happy to have her and everybody here today. So Tonya.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. When I think about Anderson Valley, I think about the first time that I arrived in the valley, my first trip, which was, gosh, 3 decades ago. And as I thought about it this morning, I thought about each vehicle I happened to be in when I was driving up. The first vehicle was a 1970s Volkswagen bus. So you can imagine coming up from Highway 128, the windy road. It was actually winter and not summer. And so it was really cold and windy road. And we get to the very top. And Philo and I just thought, wow, this is pretty neat, pretty cool. And I felt as though I'd been dropped down into some other world. And I still feel that way about Anderson Valley, Boonville, and Philo. And as I took more trips and explored more areas within Anderson Valley and tasted more wine, I realized that it's Anderson Valley, but each particular area has a signature. And that signature is in the bottle and in the glass. And depending upon who is producing the wine, it all tastes different and it all has this unique blueprint, if you would. And the deep end, which we call it the deep end, really because of where it's located, which is at the very tip top of the valley. It's the closest to the ocean. The ocean is probably about 15 miles away from that region. You can't see it because of all the redwood trees, but you can feel it because it's probably another 10, 15 degrees cooler than where you are anywhere else in the valley. I also want to give a shout out to Navarro Vineyards, who actually has trademarked it on their bottles that they produce, the deep end. Although the deep end is not actually its own geographical region, it is what we all call the deep end because of where it is and how we feel and what grows from that region. So joining us today are from Bravium Winery, Derek Rolfs, and as well as from Maggie Hawk, Sarah Woodrich, and Mark Wentworth from Wentworth Vineyards and Ranch. One of the things that I learned recently, which was very fascinating, is that in the turn of the century, there was actually a railroad that was going to be built in Anderson Valley that was going to connect Anderson Valley with San Francisco and to get all of the logging material to build the Golden Gate Bridge, which none of us, as we were doing our research and talking, had realized that that was a possibility and that that was going to happen. Um, and then, as well as all the stories of the bootleggers doing prohibition, which I'm quite sure there's a lot of bootlegging and moonshine that probably still goes on and happens, which we probably call grappa um, today. But just a really fantastic um, area. And if you look at the map and we look at Anderson Valley, we've got Boonville. Up from Boonville, we're traveling upward here and kind of drop down into Philo, Palico, and then there at the very tip top and kind of what I think of as the end of the road is the deep end. And then you see Navarro there, which is also the Navarro River there, um, traveling through. And so if you also look at the map, it's as though it's a funnel. And so all these other landscapes are above the fog, whereas the deep end is actually in the fog. And so, as always, when you are near a body of water, the fog and the cold roll in during the day. And as it gets warmer, that fog burns off. But early in the day, it comes back in again. So everything that grows in that region, all of the grapes that grow, get a fair amount of sun, but they also have a longer hang time and a longer harvest, if you would. And I know everyone has wine in their glasses today, and you're probably already gotten started, and that's okay. We want you to do that. We want you to enjoy what's in front of you this afternoon, but you also get a sense of just how different these bottlings are from the different winemakers, all coming from this area that we call the deep end. That is what I like to call a kaleidoscope of microcosms and diurnal shifts in wind and cold, as well as different soil content. So all of this really makes a difference in what goes into the bottle and what everything tastes like. So you can actually go to the next slide, and there you go. And there's our lumber yard. And this is from 1957, but I think that this was actually defunct shortly thereafter, but from the turn of the century, that's what we had. They actually put the logs on boats is what they did. And they came up with this idea because a lot of the sailors couldn't make it through and were actually perishing due to trying to build the Golden Gate Bridge. Next slide. And this brings us to Brad Wiley. Brad Wiley, Wiley Vineyards, which is the vineyard that the Bravium selection is taken from. This vineyard was actually cleared and planted in 1971. Well, Brad may not be one of the first winemakers and folks in the region. He was actually the first to plant in that region. And there's a conversation that Derek Rolfs and I had this afternoon, and I'm going to read this to you in our email of going back and forth and trying to pinpoint exactly who was the first in the region that we call close to our hearts the deep end. So Wiley was the fourth vineyard planted to the new varieties in Anderson Valley. At Meads in 1964, Hush in 1968, and Elizabeth Van Horn and Wiley in 1972. But we also, the area is known for Riesling, which was planted in 1976, which still exists today, and they continue to pull from those vines even today. But a lot of the history of the region is what I like to call all been passed down via speech, and more or less an oracle, because it's not all written down. So we have folks that are in the community that know the stories and the tales, which we got earlier this week, talking about the railroad and the bootleggers and all of that. That's how everything has been passed down about this area and this region. But I just thought it was really, really awesome and amazing to see these photos of Brad clearing this section, especially as me, a person, the first time I ever came up to Anderson Valley, I was in a 1970s Volkswagen bus. So it means a lot to me. And then my next thought process and memory is traveling up the highway into Philo in a 1950s white Cadillac with leopard print interior with some dear friends. And I'm just thought, I'm going to wear my leopard coat too, because I want to make sure that I kind of match everything. And that was another fantastic trip and just another journey within the region and the area and the people and getting to know the wines, and which leaves me now here 2 years ago coming up and hanging out and just spending time in the vineyards and in nature and tasting wine and just getting a feel for everything. And the deep end is where it's at. It really, really is. So let's bring in Derek Rolfs to talk about the Bravium Riley Vineyards Pinot Noir 2018. And as you can see, gentle slopes, everything is traditionally harvested at night, which is really very common because other parts of Anderson Valley, Mendocino are really very warm. But I don't know if everyone knows, but it's indicative of quite a few wine growing regions to harvest at night when things are the coolest. And depending upon where you are and your soil content, and what types of rocks and fossils that you have, some of those rocks and fossils do absorb the heat from the sun, which the deep end is one of those. And the heat that's in the rocks also helps in the incubation and the growth process of the vines. So even though it's nighttime, no sun, no nothing, um, the vines and the fruit's still growing. So, and here we are, Wiley Vineyard, right, kind of in the tip, in the corner there. It's appropriate that we start with this wine first. If you stick your nose in the glass, smell it, look at the color. For me, this says the deep end, this says Wiley Vineyard. Um, yeah, just bright, high tones. I can almost, and I do visualize the cold and the cool weather as well. Cherries, strawberries, and slight cream there. as well. And Derek, is Derek with us now? Can we see Derek? Derek
I am.
Ross?
Hi, Tonya.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great.
I'm
Just
just
enjoying,
basking,
just enjoying the
basking.
story about
Yeah.
the Volkswagen bus because that's Brad Wiley told me a similar story about driving up to Anderson Valley the first time in a Volkswagen bus and finding that property that you've been talking about the past few minutes. So
Yeah.
we're kindred spirits.
On that one, yeah. I hadn't thought of that in years, actually. And as I thought about my journey with Anderson Valley, that's what came to mind. But what I want to know is, who are you? Where'd you come from? And why this particular vineyard in Anderson Valley, and why Anderson Valley? I know that's a mouthful.
Yeah, those are big questions. I'll
Yeah.
try to rattle off some answers for you. I've been making wine for about 20 years now, and it all started back at a wine and spirits shop called Applejack, just outside Denver, Colorado, between Denver and the ski resorts in Colorado, where I worked for about 6 months and tasted the wines of the world. And when I returned to California, where I was born and raised, I had a hankering to learn how to make wine. Took some classes at Davis, started buying grapes and making a big mess in my garage, and that was the beginning. And eventually, I was making single vineyard Pinot Noir and Chardonnay from Santa Lucia Highlands all the way up to Anderson Valley. This is back in 2005 to 2011 or so. And my friend Jeff Brinkman, who I met early on in my winemaking, who became a mentor for me, he used to work up at Hush, and he had bought grapes from Brad Wiley and introduced me. And uh, as they say, the rest is history. So I've been working up at that vineyard for 10 years, buying grapes. After a few years, I started grafting some of the underperforming sections of the vineyard. And Brad is all about experimentation. He calls it his experimental farm. And so he let me kind of, do what I wanted to do and start to play around in the vineyard. And that led to a conversation after the 2017 harvest about, he's getting up there in years. He was getting close to 46, 47 years farming up there, and asked me to take the batons, and I started leasing and farming the vineyard 4 years ago. So now I've become the farmer I always wanted to be. I'm a first generation guy, so I didn't grow up on a vineyard or grow up with any land. So it took me a lot of years, but I finally arrived where I wanted to be when I first started this project.
So I always think of, and I think a lot of other wine professionals as well, the barrel is the winemaker's spice rack, but it's not just about the barrel and the toast of the barrel. It's also within the variety of Pinot Noir, the clonal selections. And clonal selections are basically different species of Venus vinifera of a particular variety, and they all have a different flavor profile. And so it's, in fact, clones are also the winemaker's spice rack. But then within that, we also have terroir. And what is terroir? And how does that come into play within your thought process and your selection of clones to produce the wine that we call Pinot Noir from Wiley Vineyards from Bravium?
That's a great question. I'll answer it in reverse. When I started Bravium, it was 2007, and by then I'd figured out I wanted to focus solely on Pinot Noir, and because it's such an amazing transmitter of sight and place and vintage, and eventually I came to make some Chardonnay and Rosé and even sparkling wine recently, but Pinot Noir especially, being able to capture terroir. And so what is terroir? I mean, the classic definition would be, it kind of sums up, climate, soils, aspect, I would throw tradition and people into that mix as being a part of terroir. But the name Bravium is a Latin word. It means reward, prize, or gift. And the gifts of land, the gifts of terroir, that was what I was trying to capture in naming my wine. And when I specifically started going up to Anderson Valley, a few years into my Pinot Noir winemaking, what really captured my imagination was some of those things you've already touched on. I mean, we could look at it from a geographical standpoint, which I think you and those maps did a great job illustrating. You could look at it from a geological standpoint. I might focus on the climate just for a moment. And there is the 250-ish acres that Brad bought back in 1970, 71 timeframe. And the vineyard is just to the northwest of the pond there. We have some meadowland to the southeast. And then just on the bottom of this image would be Sarah's Maggie Hawk Vineyard. We're neighbors. And we're separated by a fence, and I think we share the same bear. But just to bounce back to the climate piece and to pick that up, it was, and you made this point earlier, it was 91 degrees in Boonville yesterday, and it was 84 up at Wiley. So climate plays a role. And my friend Jeff Brinkman that I've already referenced, they have Bearwallow Vineyard located directly across Highway 128 from Wiley, my other next door neighbor. And they did a climate study and found out that the median temperatures, the mean temperatures in the deep end of Anderson Valley are actually cooler than what you'd find anywhere in Burgundy. And so what does that mean? That means that it's a cool climate site for sure. And it slows the ripening. And it means that it's a great place to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and these, cool climate varieties. And it also, I think, speaks to the differences in the wines. I know we're going to talk about the wines a little bit later, but, I work with vineyards in Boonville. I work with vineyards in Philo in the Mid Valley. I work with, or Palico as we're calling it now. I work with Wiley very closely. And I've bought 20 acres across the highway from Wiley to plant a new Pinot Noir vineyard. And it's amazing the differences in ripeness, and when we harvest these vineyards, we pick the grapes in early September in Boonville, and they come in 14+% alcohol, and they're lush and they're fruit forward. And then we pick the Mid-Valley grapes, a week or two later, and they come in the 13s maybe. And they're a little more prototypical Pinot Noir, a little more precise. And then you get down in the deep end and you're talking about, sometimes this year the 2020 wines I just analyzed are 12.6 alcohol, and we picked them in late September. So they're ripe by any metric, but they're lower alcohol. They have the crunchy red fruit, floral notes that are just signature, Wiley for me.
So it's interesting because when we talked and tasted, we did say it's crunchy red fruit. Yeah. And now this brings us to, we're looking at probably about 500, 600 feet elevation. Would you say that this particular harvest, was it the coolest that you've seen so far? Because of the levels you're saying, it's like 12.6, did you say?
Yeah, 12.6, yeah.
Yeah.
We've gone lower before. I mean, I came on the scene in 2011, and that was a pretty cool, wet, kind of weird vintage. I mean, it all depends when you pick, of course, too, right? Mm-hmm. And what is ripeness? I mean, I would be the first to admit, I probably pick at the early part of the window. If there's a window of ripeness, I'm going to be early in that process, because I want crunchiness, I want freshness, I want vitality and acidity and minerality and salinity in my wines. So that's where the people come into terroir, right?
Yes.
Speaking specifically to the elevation that you referenced before, 500 to 600 feet, that puts us, I think Sarah's vineyard would be a few hundred feet below us. We're kind of if we're in the deep end, we're on the diving board, I guess, or the cliff top, so we're a little bit elevated. And one of the other magical things about Wiley is, and I would say this is another general statement about the deep end, is our highs are a little lower and our lows are a little higher. So it's a farming advantage in the deep end. We don't really like at Wiley, frost is not a big concern. It's nothing that keeps us up at night like everyone else in the valley. And our highs, don't get quite as hot in the summertime as I've already referenced. So you have this, I would reference the wine, the 2018 vintage. You had this it was an amazing vintage, anyways. Very relatively higher yielding, but good quality. We didn't get the heat spikes, that we get sometimes around Labor Day or in the late season, and it just allows us to kind of, pick when we want, and dial in the wines exactly where we want them. You're not fighting ripeness or fighting sugar accumulation like you would be in a warmer part, not just of Anderson Valley, but anywhere else in the state.
So, because of climate and where you're located, is why you've decided to focus on these particular Pinot Noir clones. Pommard, which gives us that bright red, kind of silky raspberry, strawberry notes. And then as we go down the line, these other clonal varietals, other clones basically give us other attributes of Pinot. Yeah.
Yeah, the clones, or even if it's not clones, the selections. A lot of stuff has been brought in surreptitiously from other countries, and passed around California. So we can talk clones, we can talk selections. I think they obviously play a role. I proved that to myself. We had underperforming parts of Wiley that we grafted over to cuttings I took from other vineyards I work at. For me, the clone thing is and selection thing is kind of trying to marry up what works best in that specific site.
Yes.
And then also it's a function of how you farm, how you prune, how you manage your canopy, how you leaf. All these decisions, it's really complex. And I know we have limited time, so I'll try to just keep it top line here, but you're trying to match up what works well in a specific site and ultimately let the site speak. And I think most people that grow grapes in a vineyard will agree over time, the selections, the clones, all those things kind of fall away or dissipate a little bit, and the site character rises up. And in the case of Wiley, what I've already mentioned, the floral aromatics, the crunchy red fruit. The other thing I'm chasing in some of these selections I make and some of what I've grafted there is some amount of savoriness and some amount of, what Jancis Robinson, when she reviewed this wine, called forest floor. Yeah. Or what my friend John Gilman, from View from the Cellar, one of my favorite wine writers, he calls soil signature, or what the French might call sous-bois. Like something that's a complexing element where we're not just talking, fruit here, which is great, but something that gives the wine some complexity and character and really help it age interestingly as well.
Yeah. And I'm not going to go into what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it because I can say it with everybody. Because as you said, different selections respond to different sites differently, which is also why everyone has planted what they've planted, as well as wanting to have a signature for themselves and have the vineyard speak for itself and to give their own expression. And having said that, our next wine is the Wentworth Nash Mill Vineyard, which is Mark Wentworth, which, if we follow the line here, Nash Mill is kind of tucked away in the corner. And what I kind of like to think is it gets kind of shrouded in the fog, if you would. And as we're tasting the wines, we're discovering these different levels of concentration and intensity and fruit and layers of fruit, if you would, and also all these other qualities that come through. So whereas when we had the Bravium, the Wiley vineyard, now instead of having these kind of green dried brush coming through, we've got what I like to almost call these macerated strawberries and I think I said before summerberry pudding, which we'll talk about that later. But Mark, would you please tell us why? Why Nashville Vineyards? Where did you come from? And why this particular place? And how does it relate to everything else that you produce out of Anderson Valley?
Sure. Thanks, Tonya, and thanks for the analysis on the wine there. I think it's a unique little pocket of the deep end and the valley as a whole. And I think that's attributed to the terroir and the fact that it's kind of a little micro valley unto itself. It's a cool drainage with Little Mill Creek and Mill Creek running across the property. And, I think it's a really special spot. First came onto my radar before I was in this area. Read about Nashville from Eric Asimov back in like 2012 when Hush was making wine with the site and when it was a Hush vineyard. And it intrigued me. And back then I was just a visitor to this area and a guy who had a curiosity about the redwoods and was constantly drawn to Northern California and sought to explore this part of the world. And from an early age, I had a dream of pursuing agriculture, but I grew up in New Jersey and came here with the goal of developing my own vineyard. And so different path. And I've been making wine only now since 2017 when I bought this site. But a few years before that, I had planted vines up in the Mendocino Ridge appellation next door to Jason Drew, who's been something of a mentor to me these last many years, and a great client of mine as well since buying Nashville. And it's a wonderful community. It's a beautiful part of the world, and just feel very privileged to be able to steward the land here and do something I love and work this exceptional site and be in the deep end of the valley. On the screen now, you're looking at some of the Highland cattle that I raise. And so, the venture that I started here is multifaceted polyculture. We're not just doing grapes, we're raising some cattle, grass-fed beef. And as time goes on, probably transition more and more of the pasture over to grapevines just because I've seen what these sites are capable of. And since I've been acquainted with that potential, it makes me want to just focus on that primarily. But, I'm so happy to be here today. And the deep end is the part of the valley that I was most drawn to, certainly because of its coolness in all senses. The temperatures that you see there, the difference between the Boonville end of the valley, so pronounced, and the fact that Nashville is situated in the belt of redwoods that hugs the California coast from the Santa Cruz Mountains on north up to the Oregon border. And, those trees and their impact in the summer when it's hot and dry across much of California is so pronounced. I mean, you can walk below the trees sometimes on a summer morning and see drops falling from the needles of the redwoods. It's an amazing thing. And there's a certain magic to the area as a whole. And I think, to my mind, most of all in the deep end.
So basically what you're saying is that the redwoods actually are a buffer,
Absolutely.
against the heat, the wind, the climate, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this broader situation with accelerating climate change is something that's going to impact us all. And it's great to have the forest that we've got and the water that we have, by virtue of these trees too. And it's certainly a unique advantage that the Anderson Valley has over inland wine regions, I'd say, as we look towards the future.
Yeah, that's pretty delicious stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Sarah Wootrich from Maggie Hawk Vineyards. It is Jolie, which Jolie makes me very happy as well. And my last trip up to the valley was there on the property, and I had a chance to see that fog roll in. And in comparison to what we have with Nashville Vineyards, we're looking at Dijon Clone 667, Pomard 5. It's also organically farmed, which is something I want to talk about with everyone at the end, just whether we are green, sustainable, or biodynamic as well, because it all makes a difference in how everything tastes within flavor profiles as well. But you're right up in a corner here, and you're actually, as Derek said, you all share a fence line.
We do, yes.
And even with sharing that fence line, you're opposite ends of the spectrum. If we dive our nose into Wiley and dive our nose into Jolie, they're completely different. But it all says Anderson Valley, it all says the deep end, which, as I said, is this kaleidoscope of microcosms and just flavor profiles. Who are you, and where did you come from, and why here? Why the deep end? Why Maggie Hawk? Why Anderson Valley?
Yeah, that's again, those are all great questions. Well, this will be my 20th harvest, much like Derek. I went to UC Davis and got my degree in viticulture and enology 20 years ago, and have worked my way through wine production at different wineries throughout Sonoma County, mostly. And that's how I got into wine. But then there's the other question of how I got into wine. To me, is a different thing, like how I really immersed myself in the wine world, in the regions of wine. And Anderson Valley really stuck out to me from my days when I worked at Copan. Most of our fruit came from Anderson Valley. And when I first drove up to Maggie Hawk, it was kind of the similar feeling of, I've had the luxury of traveling the world, and it creates a feeling of awe, inspiration, and just complete reverence. I think that can be said, kind of what you said about driving up into Anderson Valley. That's the same kind of feeling. You feel remote, you feel like you're in another part of the world. And I very much get that when I arrive at Maggie Hawk every single time. It just doesn't get old. So I feel very blessed to work with the fruit from this vineyard, and to focus my energy on making 4 really stellar single vineyard Pinot Noirs, a Chardonnay and a white Pinot Noir from Anderson Valley.
I love that white Pinot Noir as well. It's delicious. And the Chardonnays. So we've been talking about clonal selections, but I also, as we've seen a snapshot of everyone's vineyard, and yours looks completely different as well. and just looking at the soil content compared to the other two, it's completely different. And also, you're using some of the same clonal selections, but you've also added Weidenschwil within your blend. And how does that play a part in the signature of the Pinot, and why that particular clone?
Yeah, so to me, 115 clone, just to back up a bit, Maggie Hawk was planted between 2000 and 2001. So again, it's like almost 20 years old here, and the vines I feel are really coming into their prime right now. 115 to me just speaks of the Jolie personality. It's very pretty, it's red fruit, it's lifted, it has the higher acid. And then, you know, each vintage I make the best blend that fits that characteristic. 2018, as you mentioned before, was a cooler year, higher yields, and we harvested actually the latest that we've harvested recently in the past few years. So in early to mid-October.
Yeah.
And so 115 is the dominant component always of Jolie, just giving that really pretty red fruit and higher acidity. And then just a tiny bit of whole cluster. It really depends on the year. I always experiment with a little bit of whole cluster. We separate every lot once it comes into the winery from the 15 blocks into a completely destemmed portion. And then a tank that gets a various amount of whole cluster, somewhere between 25, and I did 100% last year. So that was pretty fun.
Wow. And as I'm looking and just remembering, I think almost everyone does a little bit of whole cluster, at least, if not maybe 50%. But what does whole cluster actually do to the wine, and what does it impart to the finished product? Because the wines are completely different.
Yeah. So for me, whole cluster, the things that I notice about those lots that are fermented and aged separately have a 3D kind of quality to them. It's not just about the aromatics, the spiciness, and sometimes when you use higher levels of whole cluster, you'll get almost like a bubblegum aromatic, but it's all about the texture for me. Those stem tannins really give like a rustic tannin that is way different than the tannin that you'll find from oak barrels.
And see, when you say bubblegum, the first thing that comes to mind to me is carbonic maceration. Whenever I think of bubblegum, that's what I think of.
Right.
But where that may come into play, it's more like the wrapping, that kind of the powder that's on, like, let's say bazooka or something like that,
Yeah.
you know, and that's how that tannin comes through there for me. That's what that's like. And so basically 115, but everything else just kind of rounds it out, or is almost kind of the mid-weight in the palate is where these other clones kind of show up.
Yeah, they're the supporting cast to the lead actor kind of thing. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. And there we have it. So 13.8. And Mark and Derek, let's talk about the wines that are in front of us, because this is a roundtable discussion, as well as we're going to take some questions. I see that there's 12, there's 4 questions, but there's been some chat that's been going on. I haven't had time to dive into chat because we've all been talking, but it's amazing how different these wines are, but yet they're from this particular area that we've dubbed the deep end. Who wants to dive in first?
Sarah, ladies first, or you want me to go?
Go ahead.
It's been a while since I've talked, so I've got my wits about me again. No, I think you're right. They're three distinct wines. I think you could throw a bit of a blanket over them though, in the regard that I find an incredible amount of just purity of fruit. I find nice acidity on all three wines. Um, like we have this conversation about the deep end, and we're prone to be like, I guess you could take the bait. Well, the wine should all taste the same, right? They're
Yeah.
like it's this uniform region. But I mean, shoot, go to Burgundy or go somewhere where you have a wine from one side of the road and the other side of the road, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not that simple, right? So while the deep end has characteristics and some general characteristics we've touched on today, I think they play out differently in all these wines. We've talked about vine age, a little bit, or we've alluded to it. Most of the Pinot Noir vines going into the Wiley bottling were planted back in 1982. Sarah mentioned when her vineyard was planted. I've already argued that over time, the place shows a little bit more of its character relative to the genetic material, the vine material. So all these things are real complex, but I do love the fruit purity that you see in the Jolie. I love the texture and the vibrancy that you see in the Wentworth. And I think they're both awesome wines.
So, and you're absolutely right. No matter what variety, it really is all about vine age. The older the vine, the more expressive the fruit component that comes through from the plant matter. It really does make a difference.
Sure.
And Courtney, we can go to questions, and then if Mark, if you want to say something, you can as well, as we're diving in.
Could I just build on that a little bit? I mean,
Sure.
I agree with what's been said, and I love each of these wines, but yeah, I think soil, microclimate, and as Derek was saying, in Burgundy, you cross a road and all of a sudden you've got something altogether different, and it's amazing how that occurs, but it does. And then there's the dimension of farming too, and decisions in pruning and thinning, airflow throughout the vineyard over the course of the growing season, the vintage signature on top of the terroir signature. And then, the winemaking elements, was there acidulation? What type of cooperages and forests and toast levels and so forth. I mean, there's so many elements to the farmers and winemakers palate in the art of making great wine. And it's a beautiful start to work in a great place like each of us does. And it's great to approach these three distinct bottlings from a relatively small geographic area, but wildly different, each of them, and each very enticing.
Well, I guess that gets back to kind of an initial question you had, Tonya, about what makes Anderson Valley so special. I think it's because we're essentially 15 miles long by 1 mile wide, and there is such incredible diversity up and down the valley. And so, yes, we have internally these little sub-regions that we've kind of sectioned off, but within those sub-regions, there's even more diversity. So I think that's why all of us are really drawn as winemakers to this area.
So I'm going to throw it out there, but Courtney, we should do questions, and then after we do questions, I'm going to say what I want to say also about just this fantastic region we call Anderson Valley.
So, question. So what wines do you drink either internationally or from California that you would say are similar in style to Anderson Valley and Deep End?
So who wants to go first? Because as winemakers, you drink your region, but you also drink the wines of the world as well. And I'm quite sure you have your favorites, but we also want to know what's going on in other places, because sometimes those other places are inspiration as well for what you do. So Sarah, what do you drink?
I would say I've always been drawn to, not only because I was born and raised near that area, but Santa Cruz Mountains kind of rings true to me. I'm seeing, what like Seritas and Reed Holland, and Arno Roberts. Some of those guys are really making excellent wines from, again, it's mountainous, cool climate. I would also say probably Sonoma Coast, but I think Sonoma Coast, they have really intense conditions out there, and the fruit can have super intense tannin and aromatics and flavors as well. So those would be kind of the two regions I would say are, for me, similar in California, Anderson Valley.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Sarah, I'll double down double down on what Sarah just said. For my dollar, I love the Santa Cruz Mountain stuff. I saw the Riesling grapes that are own rooted, planted in 1976 at Wiley, go to Ashley Holland of Reed Holland, and she does an amazing job with them. So a lot of the wines I drink these days, especially since the pandemic, have been trades, trades with fellow winemakers, friends. I went to Hungary on a Hungarian oak expedition with the folks from Lingua Franca up in Oregon. And we trade wines, and I love drinking their stuff. And, as Sarah mentioned also earlier, I'm sure we've all been to France and Italy and all those parts of the world that are the old world places that continue to inspire.
Mark.
Yeah.
What do you drink?
Well, for me, with the focus on Pinot primarily, certainly a lot of wine from this area, but also the Sonoma Coast. Big fan of Hirsch in particular. Just the coastal expressions of Pinot Noir. There's a lot in common. I think as you move north up the coast, and this Mendocino Ridge appellation where I first planted vines is kind of a northern extension of that. And so I was drawn to those wines many years ago, and I come back to them consistently. Another region that I'm big on, Central Otago in New Zealand. I think they're making beautiful wines, and they're, great farming, nice site expression. And then of course, you can't have a discussion about Pinot Noir without acknowledging Burgundy. And, there's so many fascinating wines, and great to delve into the vineyard differences and the different producers, and to see the same site yielding different wines in the hands of different winemakers is, I think, an interesting thing to observe and enjoy and appreciate as a wine fan.
Great. We have about 6 minutes left, guys. I like the question about clonal selection. So how would you each characterize Clone 777, which is has a lot of plantings here in Anderson Valley? So
yeah, for me, 777 always ripens first, and it's quick to ripen. It's I would say medium to medium large clusters versus 115 and 667. And I think because it has a tendency to ripen quicker and develop faster, it tends to go more towards the darker fruit spectrum, blues and black fruits. That's just what I see at Maggie Hawk.
I wonder if that's one of the reasons why there's a fair amount of it planted, is because it ripens first. And it really does respond to the region. Derek, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, again, tying the clone or the selection to the place where it's planted. If you work with, as I have, with multiple vineyards that have the same clone, and you see it express itself completely differently, I think an easy one to point to would be Swan. You plant it on a valley floor, deep soils, invigorating soils. You get these huge berries, and then you plant it on a shallow hillside, 6 inches of topsoil, and you get these smaller berries, and it's a completely different grape that makes a completely different wine. A lot of them, I think at this point, I don't know, there are differences, but they're subtle differences, and they're site-specific differences. There are some outliers, like 943 I work with at one vineyard, and it's just so dark in color and has a completely different tannin profile and mouthfeel. So some of those outlier clones, I'm like, wow, that's a huge difference. It's almost like, a different thing altogether.
Syrah or something. Yeah.
Right.
like a Syrah, right? And a Pinot Noir masquerade, or however you do that. But the but these clones we're talking about, most of the clones that are planted in our vineyards, I think it's a smaller range of characters, and it does just create complexity, and it's kind of fun. It's the experimental aspect of this. We experiment in the vineyard, we experiment in the winery, and I think that's one of the things that we all, I guess, love about the work we do. It never gets boring, and we can, 50 years from now, if we're lucky enough still to be at it, we'll still be experimenting, trying to figure this out.
I think that's what's really so exciting, being able to experiment within where you are. What do you think, Mark?
I certainly agree with that. This is a lifelong journey, I think, in the best cases. And certainly that's my dream here. But as far as clones go, I think the site signature point really rings true. The 777 up here on the ridge, pretty different from where I've seen it at other people's vineyards. And 943, personal favorite clone of mine. Certainly, I grafted some at Nash Mill last year, and I'm pretty excited for that. Small clusters, low yields, but such great intensity, and that beautiful purple color that you get. I love that clone. But there's so much to the site dimension, I think, when it comes to clones, at least in my experience these last several years. And I think it's a fun thing to get better acquainted with each site that you work with, and to continue to experiment and try different levels of whole clusters, different levels of destemmed lots, different cooperages, and it all adds up to hopefully something that we can all savor and enjoy in the glass.
And every vintage is different. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
No homogeneous wine here.
No.
So Tonya, we've got, we're wrapping up here. I'd love to hear your concluding thoughts and love for Anderson Valley and Pinot Noir.
Anderson Valley and Pinot Noir. Mark mentioned Signal Ridge and Mendocino Ridge, and the first thought that I had was another snapshot of the region. And that's what we have when we go into these different vineyard sites, whether it's to the north or to the south, whether it's in the warm belt or in the cooler belt. It's a different wine, and it's a different experience. It's a pleasant experience. And it's not just Pinot Noir, it's Chardonnay, it's Austrian and German varietals, all sorts of great varieties that are planted in this region.
And bubbles.
And bubbles, yes.
Yeah.
Me, of all people, to not mention bubbles, right? Miss Bubblehead.
Yeah.
But it's just really, really fantastic. And it takes you on a journey, and it's a lifelong journey that you'll never grow tired of. And it's a walk, but it's a fantastic walk, and it's a fantastic journey. And it's one that more people need to take that journey and take that walk and look through the kaleidoscope that is Anderson Valley. And those are my thoughts on Anderson Valley. I don't know about anybody else, but I like kaleidoscopes. I was a kaleidoscope kid.
Cheers.
Well, cheers
Fully
on
agreed.
that. It's a great note to leave on. So,
Yeah.
Tonya, thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome. It was my pleasure.
Sarah,
I'm gonna
Mark, Eric.
take these off now. Sometimes I need my readers just to see myself, and everybody else. But the wines are fantastic. you know.
Yeah, and we
it's,
loved having everybody here today on calling in and who could not come to Pinot Fest, right? So Pinot Month,
Yeah.
celebrating all things Pinot. So this was one way to make that possible. And we have Passport Weekend in the Valley this weekend. We're inviting a bunch of guests, and we have a few more webinars next Wednesday and then the following. So we invite everybody to tune in, and thank you for supporting Anderson Valley and Anderson Valley Pinot Noir. So.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks, everybody.
for joining us
Thank you.
today. Thank you. And here's to always, always drinking great wine and drinking wine from Anderson Valley.
Here.
Cheers, everybody.
Here's Tonya. Well done, everyone.
That
And
was
thank
so
you to
much
Ben
fun.
Fine. Actually, he's also not on screen, but Ben, who organized
Mm.
a lot of these efforts. So
Thank you,
what a
Courtney.
group. Yeah. Have a great evening, everyone.
I
Okay,
didn't
thank
get
you.
to see any, I didn't get to read anything in chat. If anybody
Well-
said anything, I'm sorry I missed it.
We can keep you up. We can keep it up. I'll turn off the recording. You're welcome to go in there and check it out.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Turn to overtime. Overtime. Come on, let's do it.
Overtime,
Well, I
we can
wanted
keep
to-
recording. You guys can
Bonus
keep
round.
I wanted
chatting.
to keep going because
Put some
you know,
sparkle
I
in.
know because you know
We're skip
people
forward
don't.
virtually.
I know people don't always put everything in Q&A. Sometimes they put questions in the chat.
Yeah, they've been coming back and forth.
So
Yeah, we
I
could
don't
stay
know if we
on. It's
missed
happy
anything.
hour time, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. So
It's too
what
bad
are
we can't
we-
invite panelists to come on. I mean, participants.
Okay, let's see who else.
I see a lot of thank yous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hour
And the
goes by
Highland
quick, doesn't
Kettle,
it?
beautiful.
You ask these great questions, Tonya, but they take like 3 hours to answer them, and we have a whole hour. So
I know. It's okay. I mean, people got the gist of it. We
absolutely.
didn't want to get too geeky, just geeky enough to be dangerous. To get
That's how you
people
build. That's how you
some
build a round
ammo.
2 tasting. That's how you bring them in for another one.
That's
we'll
right.
do it.
Keep them coming.
Yeah.
Hey,
Keep 'em
Tonya and
coming.
team,
Yes.
John Barecki, I'm not sure if he's still on, but he's curious, you know, AV versus Russian River in particular, maybe some producers here
Oh.
that might be a good parallel for him to be introduced to.
So we actually talked about that in one of our sessions. You know, because Russian River labeling says Russian River, although there are sub AVAs in Russian River, and we talked about that. There are like 24 of them. But to put them all on a label gets to be a bit much. So for me, I always find out exactly where things are located, and I always ask questions from winemakers. You know, where is it exactly? Where is the vineyard? And I can kind of figure out also from flavor profile where things are. That's why I talk about clonal selection and all that stuff all the time. But it helps me do my job better, but it also helps me in purchasing wine, and also when I talk to people about wine. I talk about wine a lot.
That's a tricky one. It's kind of like it's hard to answer that question just for the deep end, right? Like what is the character of the deep end, right? So and Russian River is even bigger and more diverse, like you said. But I make Chardonnay in Russian River, and I also make Chardonnay in Anderson Valley, or grow and produce wines. And Russian River has a way of getting, I don't know if the right word is right, but lusher.
Yeah.
A little more lush, a little more textured, softer textured.
Feels like less acid too. Just like
less acid, yeah. So I mean, if we're gonna just speak in the world of generalities here, that's my consistent impression across vintage after vintage. Versus the stuff I get from Anderson Valley is a little more cut and a little more precise and a little more of that acid backbone or spine. Those would be some real broad brushstrokes on
Yeah.
those two.
no, I would agree with
Well
But
said.
I also,
Derek.
the purity of fruit that comes through in these wines as well. If you just take a snapshot, it's not just the concentration, it's the purity and the brightness of the fruit.
And relative
across the board.
weightlessness too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's complexity and there's fruit, but it's not heavy. None of these ones are heavy. They're elegant and weightless, not overly powerful,
Yeah.
It's
And I think
carried through with the acid and the mineral
right.
Yeah.
too.
And those defining characteristics, I think, really lend these wines to versatility in terms of pairings and
Yeah.
general food friendliness.
But I'm super happy tasting them with nothing in front of me.
Me too.
My palate is not
Exhausted. Yeah.
it's not exhausted, but
Yeah.
it actually makes me want to eat
Yeah.
because the
Right.
tannin structure that comes through, it's mouth-watering across the board. I want something in front of me. I want to eat something, but I still want to drink everything that's in front of me.
Right.
You
Yet
know?
another thing to love about Pinot Noir, right? I mean, you can have it with and without food. It makes you want to have food, and
Yeah.
it tastes good in its youth, and it tastes sometimes great when it's aged, right? So, you can't say that about every variety. That's for sure.
No.
Yeah.
And it's an exercise to have something that is mature and that has been aged, as well. Whether or not it has ageability, these all have ageability. You can age these if you would like to, if you choose to.
If you have the willpower.
Oh, that too.
That's the fun thing that I think Anderson Valley, like, we don't see enough of is library, right? And like these like library tastings. So
For sure. Need it.
somehow we have to figure that
That's-
out.
Yeah.
Well, there's some stuff around. You have to ask.
Right.
I'm a believer. I'm a beggar. I don't have to have a lot. Just 3 bottles. Just so if somebody asks me, I can offer it, right? And I can have them experience this, because it's what was in the bottle in its youth, but much more nuanced now,
Definitely.
Yeah.
So we're doing this again in 30 years with the same 3 wines, right?
Let's do it. I'll pencil it in.
That'd be cool.
Right.
Yeah.
All
right.
Google calendar.
Put your wines up. Put a label on there.
I don't even think you can't hold out for 30 more years.
Hold out for 3 weeks when we got the show.
Challenge.
Or 3 days. I don't even think I made it 3 days. I already cracked into all of them. So
That's right. When we talked, you're like, they were all really good.
yeah.
I drank them all.
The cat that ate the canary, the feathers hanging in my mouth.
It's sticking out. Yeah.
Good canary.
Yeah. You were like, from what I remember.
And the other thing I think we should all do is go down and hang with Tonya at a restaurant.
One market. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
That'd be fun.
Cassini.
We can do
That's
these
right.
things again, and I think that would be fun to do.
That would be fun.
I agree.
Yeah.
Would you host an Anderson Valley tasting at your place?
Oh, absolutely.
Cool.
That'd be
Okay,
fun.
we've talked about that.
Boom.
Yes.
Yeah, we talked about that before COVID.
Do a trade tasting at one market. Yeah.
That'd be amazing. Yeah.
Bring Anderson Valley to everybody.
That's
Those that
right.
can't come up.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Gillian
needed.
chimed into the chat. So big thanks to Gillian for all of her behind the scenes efforts as well.
Thank you, as always. Gillian's my fairy godmother.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks, Gil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So excited that this actually came into fruition and it happened.
Yeah.
Because we've talked
Yeah.
about it for a while now. It's been a couple of years and we were able to do it. So super excited about that. So yeah.
And Peggy Ridley, a vineyard owner here in Anderson Valley, opened a 2010 Skewis Ridley Vineyard the other night, and it was beautiful. So,
Cool.
I
Yeah.
saw her note. She
Thanks,
said
Skewis.
777 is hitting 20 years.
yeah,
For now, she said her vines are.
right.
Yeah.
She planted that vineyard.
That's me texting you, Courtney.
And you know,
Hey, Ben's back in.
Sorry.
Ben.
Hey,
I took a phone call. There were some people watching, so I just wanted to like, yeah, what do you guys fit? Check
Yeah.
in.
Good.
But you guys did
yeah,
awesome.
those skewest wines rock.
Yeah,
I used
they're
to have
legit.
some library selections of skewest. I used to keep those around. Those were kind of my back pocket, whether they're in 375s or in 750s.
Yeah, he
These are
used to
for
do a
Latin.
Wiley as well, just like Jason Drews worked up there.
Yeah,
Thanks, Skewis. He hung it up though a few years back.
yeah. Like I said, used to.
You still.
Michael Sheeran is saying if you still want questions, talk about something.
Ah!
I know Michael Sheeran, so can anyone see his chat question? I don't know.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
see
what
it.
did he say? What does it say?
What do you say? I couldn't see it.
Talk about
Oh.
opening of the deep end AV to the ocean and
Santa
compare it to
Rita.
that
Well, Santa Rita
look.
runs this way,
Right.
That's a good question.
and AV runs not as perpendicular. So Santa Rita has a one up on us on that total funnel of ocean influence. But I think we are
Yeah.
pretty influenced by what comes off Mendo Coast.
Who needs maps when you have arms?
That's right.
You and Derek were both.
It's the deep end dance. Yeah.
Deep end dance. Oh,
We'll make it go
down to
viral.
something.
There you go. A TikTok.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
We gotta
TikTok.
go.
Uh-oh.
Our valley
Anderson
goes like
Valley,
this, not
deep
like
end
this.
dance.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
right.
man.
Courtney, if you didn't have enough, you got to make the Anderson
Yeah,
Rita.
I know.
TikTok.
AV
Yep.
goes like that. Yeah. We'll lam it like that. Yeah.
YMCA?
Yeah.
I mean, we'll all be up there this weekend. Let's get together and film a little dance. That'd be
Peggy,
Peggy
2
said
years
we
in a
are
row
not
for Tonya.
sideways.
we're not sideways.
We're not sideways.
No, we're not
no.
sideways.
Thank
That's
goodness
Santa
we're not
Rita.
sideways. Oh my God.
Oh, fun.
Thank you, Michael, for your question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, Michael's a good guy. Hi, Michael.
It's so good to see everybody. I can't wait for more in-person opportunities.
How many
Likewise.
people are still on this right now?
30.
31,
Oh,
yeah.
cool.
Oh,
Bantering
Hi.
around.
Yeah.
Like I said, I wish we could bring them in, but the webinar platform doesn't let us.
They can still throw
That's what
things
we'll
in
do
the
next time we
chat.
listen.
Oh,
There's
hey, Gil. There's one of them.
Fantastic tasting.
Cheers.
Awesome.
Well, here's to Pinot Fest 2022.
There you
Yeah.
go.
That's right, at Scharfenberger Cellars. May
It'll be fun.
20th.
Clink.
Clink, clink.
Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna last all 30 people that are sticking around, but I just want to say it was amazing working with you guys, and the fact that people are sticking around and all the questions are such a good sign. So I think, hopefully we can do this again, like you said, 2022 or before, after. Bubbles can be included, I think.
We should do this more
Very
often,
Yeah, we should.
actually. 'Cause-
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great way, and with the national pack, opportunity.
we should just have like
opportunity to
office
stack.
hours, like a professor
Yeah,
for 2 hours, and people can just reel their questions in the comments, and we just sit here and riff off of them. What do you think?
you
How
being
much fun would that be?
That would be
With a
fun.
bottle of bubbles.
Yeah.
well, Sarah, isn't the Elevage a series that was pitched, right? This is the first of a series where the webinars there were 4 for Pinot Month, but Elevage is something we want to take to be kind of the ongoing Anderson Valley webinar series, right?
Yeah.
I
That's a
think
great
what we
idea.
were talking about.
It's great.
That's a great idea. Yeah,
So,
I like that. Elevage.
Totally.
Elevage,
Learn more continuously.
always.
We.
Mm-hmm.
tagline. All right, guys. Have a
Yeah.
good
Hey,
night.
guys.
Cool.
All right.
Is time to exit, I guess?
We don't know if these participants drank all the wine and fell asleep or not. So yeah, I'm gonna say goodbye.
Thanks, Ben.
So good
Thanks,
working with you
Ben.
guys. See
Thank
some of
you,
this
Ben.
weekend. Take care.
Great job,
you.
I'm
everybody.
waving.
Thanks,
I know you
guys.
can't see me, but I'm waving. Bye,
Oh,
y'all.
Patty says disco.
Disco
at
Ranch.
Friday.
Yeah, I'll be there. 3 to 6. Come see me and say
Oh,
hi.
that's right.
And direct.
Disco